There was going to be a time, sooner or later, in which those regional and sub-regional experiences were going to come together to build a global prohibition and global nuclear weapon-free zone.
That's the voice of Ambassador Elayne Whyte, a diplomat and academic who played an active role in the creation of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the TPNW or just the Ban Treaty. She joins host Michelle Dover as today's guest in this special bonus episode of Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. Today's episode marks the one-year anniversary of the day the Ban Treaty came into force. You'll hear about how the Ban Treaty came to be, as well as the importance of the treaty itself to global efforts to create a nuclear weapons-free world.
To say that Ambassador Elayne Whyte is a Costa Rican diplomat and academic would be an understatement. Between 2014 and 2020, she served as Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the UN in Geneva, and in 2017, she presided over the UN conference that negotiated and adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Over the years, she has held different leadership positions in disarmament treaty regimes. And earlier, she was the first and youngest woman and the first person of African descent to serve as Costa Rica's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and was the executive director of the Mesoamerica Integration and Development Project, which coordinates and delivers social and economic development projects across the Central American region. She has combined a diplomatic career with an academic career, serving as a professor, including at the National University of Costa Rica and the UN-mandated University for Peace. This year, she is an Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellow at Harvard University. Ambassador Whyte, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michelle. It's very nice to be here. I feel humbled and I am very eager to share some thoughts with you and your audience.
Well, let's dive straight in. January 22nd of 2022 marks the one-year anniversary of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entry into force. Looking back, what do you see as the highlights of this past year?
Actually, I like to think about this period, not only about last year, which has been really a wonderful year, full of joy, full of sense of fulfillment, but also I like to think about the last 2 years, because I think it has been an extraordinary period that we have been able to move the process of ratification forward so that we see the entry into force of the treaty within extraordinary circumstances. The years 2018 and 2019, we were promoting more signatures and giving time for the countries to comply with the internal processes for ratification of international treaties. So the year 2020, we also kept on working, but it has come as a good surprise to see that the process of ratification has followed a steady pace, despite all the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic and the political situation all around the world. So I think this year has been special in the sense that there has been a reaffirmation of the commitment of most countries in the world with the total renunciation of nuclear weapons or the nuclear weapon option for the majority of humanity. And it has been also extraordinary. We have been able to send this strong message of this commitment, unwavering commitment with this treaty, despite, as I said, of these extraordinary circumstances throughout the world.
You mentioned the extraordinary circumstances, and how has it compared to what you envisioned in the early days of negotiating the treaty?
Well, I have to say that most treaties, most treaties take from 3 to 5 years so that countries actually go through all the internal process and proceedings. And from the year 2017, that's the moment in which the treaty was adopted and open for signature in September of 2017 to October of 2020, it took exactly those 3 years that usually are the average, let's say the average time frame that takes 4 years from negotiation to entry into force. So I think it did follow my expectations of the time frame, but in the more aspirational tone of those expectations, because it could have taken 5 years because of those extraordinary circumstances that I was mentioning. So the fact that it took 3 years for the treaty to comply with the threshold for entry into force, I think it, as I said, it came as a very good surprise. It's a very good message, I think, of, let's say, the expectations that I had for the process.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have seen and worked within many disarmament related treaties. So when you talk about average timeframes, I know this is coming from experience as well as study and on all different types of weapons. Why do you think that this treaty was successful and was able to come into existence? Not all ideas, as you mentioned, make it to that final stage.
Well, definitely this treaty is a success story. And it is a success story, I think, first and foremost, because there was a strong coalition. The majority of the international community, the majority of the international systems, the majority of the states of the United Nations have already given up the idea that their security is going to be sought after nuclear weapons. So this is something that we must not forget, that this is an aspect of nuclear policy that needs to be taken into account and needs to be highlighted more often. It is the majority of humanity, actually, that has already made a very clear option to building a weapon-free security paradigm. The issue of this strong coalition, I think, lies at the bottom of the success. There are different regions in the world that have already built nuclear weapon-free zone treaties and nuclear weapon-free zones, and that there was going to be a time, sooner or later, in which those regional and sub-regional experiences were going to come together to build a global prohibition and global nuclear weapon-free zone. I think there is also another aspect that is fundamental in the process, in this success story, which is that we see in the world and international relations today, there is this pluralization of agency and leadership in the global scenario. And this means that civil society and all kinds of states, middle powers, small states, are eager to lead global processes that we strongly believe in, that are fundamental for the good of humankind, without necessarily having to wait for the great powers' leadership or engagement in the process. This is a defining characteristic of the 21st century global politics. And this process was able to benefit from this new agency, that in this democratization of a process and diplomatic processes that allow for civil society and non-state actors of all kinds, being academic or activists, together with states and national governments, to forge these very strong coalitions, to take on board processes and promises that have been waiting for decades. I think also in this lead up to the success of the Prohibition Treaty, we have to identify the importance and the impact that an appropriate linkage between science and policy is bringing to today's negotiation processes. The fact that we were able to see diplomatic and to have diplomatic conferences that actually reviewed the scientific evidence of what exactly it will mean or it would mean in today's world to see another detonation of a nuclear weapons. It definitely gave new momentum. It gave new gravitas, as they say, to this historic process of seeking a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. Let us recall that the call for the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons was actually started practically the day after the nuclear detonations in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it took the international community decades I think also that civil society not only helped to mobilize states and states' political will, pursue new strategy, pursue new paradigm to deal and to work in terms of nuclear disarmament, which was to go for a prohibition treaty that would stigmatize nuclear weapons. Civil society did not only offer this hopeful new path and new strategy, I think they were able to imprint national governments with new enthusiasm. And that is vital because we saw very important leadership in the support coalition and in the core group of governments that led the process within the institutional and political structure of the United Nations. This did require a strategic leadership, commitment, and a group of strong individuals, very committed to the cause, but also very knowledgeable about the UN processes and about disarmament overall. So I would like to highlight those aspects. The role of civil society, of course, fundamental, the strong coalition, the possibility of bringing together scientific evidence and political wisdom to review the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons gave a new momentum to this historic process. And last but not least, we have to say that the negotiations themselves were also successful because we had the commitment from the countries, but also because the process was actually benefited from many different aspects that are not maybe visible. Let me just mention, for instance, an aspect that you don't usually see, which is the fact that we were able to achieve the substantive negotiations within a tremendous time pressure, but at the same time that we were undergoing very important administrative and logistic support pressures within the organization to be able to finish on time and to have the text being translated. Everything worked around the clock. Everything. There were many different aspects, both substantive, political, and logistic, that came together to make this treaty a reality. It is definitely a success story.
I also had another question on the individual level. One of the things that I noticed in watching the negotiations, and this could have been, of course, because I felt like a very accessible negotiation. It was pretty clear of what was going on and who was involved, but that was the leadership of women in the process, both within civil society and within the negotiating teams. Is that something that was unique to this treaty, or is it building on of what we've seen over the course of years? Did you notice it?
I have to admit that I did not notice it when you are in the situation. You don't necessarily notice until you start actually reflecting about the process. And somebody that was writing a book about the process asked me what role gender had played. And I realized that I had not stopped to have a really deep reflection on this aspect. I think it is also part of the challenges of my generation of women leadership, of many women leaders who are faced with the opportunity to be the first ones leading certain processes. Having said that, it is true that most of the components of the negotiation success and of the different players that took part in the negotiations were led by women. Not only the institutional facilitation, which was on my shoulders, but also the representative from the United Nations Secretariat, the representative of the Secretary General, Mrs. Umi Nakamitsu. The leadership of civil society was in the hands of women, but also the victims were also being represented and were very strong voices of men and women, of course, by representing the victims, but also there was a very important leadership of women leadership from the victims. So we have civil society, we have academia, we have government, and we have the institutional representation, both were women. And definitely the negotiations were a space of collaboration, of deep and human conviction, and we would say ideas about how to not fail. We knew we could not fail. And I definitely think when you go and study the scientific evidence about the different characteristics that men and women have at the negotiation table, definitely we do have to acknowledge the fact that this was a negotiation process that was submitted to tremendous pressures of different kind, and it was very successful, among other things, because of the leadership that was exerted by many wonderful women that I had the opportunity to work with.
Thank you for sharing, because I will say, just for myself, it was really an inspiring thing to see. Taking a step back, you've worked on a range of challenges over the years, from international cooperation frameworks to address snakebite poisonings to strengthening Mesoamerican regional integration. How do you see nuclear weapons issues fitting in to the overall set of challenges that humanity is facing now?
You know, there is some difference that I have seen in the way in which nuclear weapons are approached from different countries. Most of the time, non-nuclear weapon states, because we have already completely renounced nuclear weapons and nuclear related security doctrines. That is something that is not subject to domestic discussion, because we have integral and systematic development problems that we need to tackle. And most of the times, for non-nuclear weapon states, the discussion about the achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons is more concentrated on foreign policy structures of different countries. What I want to say with this is that we see the issue of nuclear weapons in an integral, holistic, and systematic way, together with all the rest of the problems of humanity and the development problems of our countries. And the difference that I have seen is that in many nuclear weapon states, there are structures, very large structures of experts and companies and universities and government structures that are focused on dealing with the issue of nuclear weapons only. So it is more challenging or more difficult for these countries to see the interlinkages between the existence of nuclear weapons and how those affect, let's say, the overall problems of humanity. It is therefore somewhat difficult to understand, for instance, let me just cite this example, that the nuclear weapon states policies do not necessarily reflect on the impact of any nuclear weapons use on the environment, on climate change, on the impact on women and girls, on indigenous populations. And this is something that is much more obvious for non-nuclear weapon states, because we tend to have a more systemic view of the impact of nuclear weapons, and we approach the issue from a more holistic perspective. That definitely is something that I was able to see and to observe. We need to have more interdisciplinary dialogues, definitely, to be able to better understand and to better tackle the problem of nuclear weapons, because we have a problem with the existence and the persistence of nuclear weapons in today's world for humanity as a whole.
So, thinking about this interdisciplinary dialogue in the context of the TPNW, as of right now, COVID permitting, the first meeting of states parties for the treaty will be held in March. What will you be watching for, or what would you be thinking of as potential hallmarks of a successful first meeting?
Well, I think the first meeting of state parties of any regime is, of course, a fundamental step that marks the beginning of the functioning and the dynamics of the regime. It is the first meeting where some fundamental aspects are discussed and many times agreed upon regarding, for instance, the need to establish a support infrastructure for the regime, whether it's secretariat, institutional support, financial matters, rules of procedure. in that sense, this first meeting of state parties is going to be a normal, to put it that way, a normal meeting of state parties that is going to need to tackle, to decide upon the rules of procedure and what kind of secretariat support, institutional support we are going to rely on for the functioning of the regime. But at the same time, this is going to be the kickoff of the substantive discussions. And we have already a task. The treaty text is left for the first meeting of state parties, which is to determine what is going to be time frame that we consider to be both feasible, technically, scientifically feasible for, let's say, a nuclear weapon state to dismantle its nuclear weapon programs and to completely destroy all the nuclear arsenal. What is feasible? What is reasonable, to put it that way? What is reasonable to expect in the definition of a time frame for a nuclear weapon state to achieve its disarmament commitments? Not only what is technically feasible and scientifically feasible, but what is politically correct and what is politically appropriate. Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is it 30 years? Or is it 200 years? Like, we know that this is not something we can leave open. There is a legal obligation for any nuclear weapon state that decides to join the treaty. There is a legal obligation to completely destroy the arsenal. And the meeting of the negotiation conference decided that the first meeting of state parties was the venue where that time frame needed to be defined. So this is an obligation that we have, according to the treaty, to have that discussion and to agree on a time frame that any nuclear weapon state should follow in the process of submitting this legally binding, time-bound plan for the verified and irreversible elimination of that state party's nuclear weapons program, including the elimination of irreversible conversion of all nuclear weapons related facilities. So I think overall, this regime needs to consider what will happen if a nuclear weapon state decides to join the treaty and accomplish disarmament obligations bound by the treaty provisions. That is going to trigger many different discussions, substantive discussions that need to be started. What is the best way to start this discussion is by defining terms of reference for this discussion, is by deciding what kind of scientific advisory we can count on, expert advisory we can count on, and how we compare this task of having technical and specific advisory, how it has developed in other regimes, what we can learn, what lessons we can learn from other regimes, and define how in this regime we establish an appropriate dialogue between scientific expertise and political process. But of course, there are other aspects, there are going to be other discussions that are going to be started. For instance, the issue of treaty implementation, how the state parties are going to go about the treaty implementation at the domestic level, because it deals with the different legal traditions in different countries about how international treaties are implemented at the domestic level, whether you require treaty implementation, secondary legislation, or you have other measures that you have to develop to make sure that the country is implementing the provisions. We also have to decide how we are going to discuss about victim assistance, environmental remediation, contemplating in Article 6, how we are going to organize a discussion about international cooperation. I would say, Michelle, that looking at how different regimes develop and by seeing the life cycle of regimes, I would expect that we can see this first meeting of state parties within the first life cycle of the treaty, which is usually a 5-year cycle before the first review conference. It will be very interesting if the parties plan what decisions need to be taken the first year and what discussions need to be organized in the first year, and think about this 5-year cycle and what we can accomplish in the second meeting and in the first review conference at the 5th year. I would like to see that strategic thinking and strategic cycle consideration and planning so that we have a more rational way of organizing what expectations we can build for each meeting of state parties of this new regime.
Ambassador Whyte, I can't believe how much time has flown. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this really important treaty 1 year after its entry into force. And I am very much looking forward to discussing other topics with you soon. So listeners, stay tuned. This is not the last time you'll be hearing from her.
Thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure. And I am really looking forward to this great event of 2022, the first quarter of 2022, which is the first meeting of state parties of the treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons for the first time in 7 decades. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Xing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Xing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.